postulates. And these are the accepted way we prove that any set of symptoms is caused by an infectious agent. And they're used and essentially approved by all the infectious disease people and virologists in the world. So Koch's postulates are basically four. And let's take a very simple example so that everybody can understand this. The first postulate is that people have essentially the same set of symptoms. And so let's take the example of meningococcal meningitis. That's a type of meningitis that's caused by a bacteria called meningococcus. And essentially, all the people with that meningococcal meningitis, they have a high fever, they're extremely sick, they have a very characteristic rash, and if nothing is done, and even sometimes if anything is done, they will die in 2 to 3 days. And that's 100% of the people have the identical symptoms. Now, once you have a person with those symptoms, you can take some of their blood and you can do what we call a blood culture, where we attempt to grow an organism out of their blood. And what you find is 100% of those people with meningococcal meningitis grow out a culture of pure meningococcus in their blood. 100%, not 50%, not 80%, 100%. The next thing, and that's postulate number two. Postulate number one is people have more or less the same symptoms. Postulate number two is that in those people with the symptoms, they all have the same organism and only that organism growing out in their blood. Postulate number three is that none of the people walking around who are normal, presumably like most of us, none of us have meningococcus growing in our blood. It's simply not compatible with normal health. So that's postulate number three. Postulate number four is once you have a pure culture of meningococcus and you grow it out, you can isolate and purify that bacteria. You can then inject it or expose another person, which you wouldn't want to do, or an animal who's susceptible to that bacteria. And 100% of them will get meningococcal disease. And then 100% of those, you can then grow out meningococcus in their blood. And then you could keep that thing going basically forever. Now, let me just stop here for a minute, because I realize that this talk is going to get very technical for some. And frankly, I just don't know any other way to do it, because this is the things that I think you need to know. So in other words, to summarize, the way we prove infectious etiology or infectious causation is we have people with the same or very similar symptoms. We grow out a pure culture of that organism, whatever it is that's causing it, from the blood or the respiratory secretions, and only that organism is found. Then we take that organism, we purify it, we inject it into a susceptible animal, and they get the same disease, and then we culture that organism out from them. And that proves that it's that organism caused that disease. Now, you can do the same thing with viruses. So let's take an example of chickenpox. It's a common childhood viral infection. More or less, every child with chickenpox has the same set of symptoms. They have a low-grade fever, sometimes it's a little higher. They don't feel so good. They have a vesicular or bubbly rash, and that's how we know it's chickenpox. Now, you can then take the blood or the fluid from these bubbles, and you can look at it under an electron microscope, and you will find millions of copies of the virus in the blood. That's called viremia. Or you can find thousands, maybe millions of copies from the bubbles, the blisters on their skin. You don't find any other virus. You find a pure culture of this chickenpox virus from either the blood or the vesicles. You can then look at the at normal people, sorry, I misspoke about third postulate with meningococcus, is no normal people have meningococcus growing in the blood. Similarly with chickenpox, there's no normal people like you or I walking around who have millions of copies of chickenpox virus in our blood, and we don't have any of these vesicles. And if we do have had a blister, it wouldn't have any chickenpox virus in it. And then number four, the fourth postulate, is you could take some of this virus, you could purify it. And when I say purify it, I mean you do something to it, filter it or whatever, so that the only thing you're injecting or exposing the animal to is a pure culture of chickenpox virus. And then 100% of them who are not immune, they will get sick, they will have chickenpox virus in their blood and then their blisters, and then so on. That is how all doctors, all virologists, all infectious disease people understand how to prove an infectious origin. Now, there's a long history of this, which I just going to briefly mention, because when you look at what's happening in with this so-called coronavirus epidemic, the first thing you notice is this started in Wuhan, we're told. And then you say, what were the symptoms of the people in Wuhan? So the best that we know of, the symptoms were low-grade fever and dry cough. Now, unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, but realistically, that is not a very specific set of symptoms. Lots of people have low-grade fever and dry cough, including people who have bronchitis, including people sometimes with asthma, people with exposed to air pollution, and a whole host of other things. So that first postulate, everybody has the same symptoms, is actually not met in this situation. And so then the next thing is, do all those people, okay, so maybe they all have a low-grade fever and dry cough, and that's just what it is. What should have happened, and what, if I was the CDC expert and I was called to investigate, or if you call the Chinese virology authorities or the American virology authorities, if you say, it looks like a new disease. There's people who have a dry cough and low-grade fever and this shadowing on their CT scans of their lungs. We've never seen that before. Can you come and investigate to see if there's an infectious etiology? Okay, fair enough. So what I want you to do is line up 500 people, all with that same symptoms, and we're going to do an electron microscopy examination of their sputum and their blood, and we're going to find out if all of them have millions of copies of this, of a virus, and then we're going to characterize the virus and see what happens. The next thing I would do is I would ask them to take 500 people who are perfectly normal, because you need a control in this, and say, let's look at their blood and their sputum and see how many of them have millions of copies of the virus in their blood or their respiratory secretions. And the answer should be 100% of the first 500 have millions of copies, and 0 of the second group have this millions of copies. Then we would purify those millions of copies of the virus from the first group, find a susceptible animal and either inject it or put it in their nose or squirt it down their throat. We would do then a control, so we would take a saline solution or something like that and do the same thing, except it didn't have the virus. And if all of them got sick and all of them had millions of copies, we would prove that this was because of this new virus. So that's how this, quote, should have been done. Now let's look at how it was done. As far as we know, and where I'm getting this from is a search for PubMed, a search for articles, and people are sending me things to corroborate this, and so I would go to infectiousmyth.com. As far as we know, not only are there not 500 people who had this done, as far as I can tell, there was nobody who had this done. There was not a single person who had these symptoms who had millions of copies of coronavirus isolated from their blood or sputum. What they said was, and what they published, and I've seen the articles, is we have people who are sick. Here's a smear of their electron microscopy examination. And you see lots of things. You see cellular debris. You see a number of different things that look like viruses. And one of them looks like a coronavirus. So that's a completely different story than what I described for meningococcus or chickenpox. So, and then they did not do an examination, electron microscope of 500 normal people. They simply didn't do it. Now, the people who wrote the articles then said, and I quote, "We did not attempt to purify the virus," which, if you think about it, is mind-boggling. Because if they didn't purify the virus, how do they know that that was the cause of the disease? And the answer is there's no way to know that. But they did take the virus and they did a genetic sequence of it. The genetic material of a coronavirus is RNA, not DNA. And they said, this is a new genetic sequence which we haven't seen in a coronavirus before. Therefore, this is the cause of the disease. And all I can say is this flies in the face of everything we know about virology and infectious causation. And I would also point out that this is not the first time this has happened. In fact, it happens basically every time. And let me just give you one example. Around the later part of the 1800s, there was people showing up with a new set of symptoms of acute paralysis. And eventually that was called polio. And because this was the time of Pasteur and the whole inauguration of the germ theory, by the way, as many of you probably know, apparently Pasteur recanted the germ theory and eventually said the germ is nothing, it's all the terrain or the experience of the person. But let's skip that for a minute. So they had these bunch of people with the symptoms of acute paralysis. That's what we call polio. It also was the time when they were first spraying the orchards and the apple trees with something called lead arsenic. Now, the part of your body that has the pathology, the part that's sick, is called the anterior horn cells of the nervous system. That's why you get paralysis. It turns out that lead arsenic and then later DDT are very specific poisons for exactly that part of the nervous system. So anyways, they said, well, this must be an infection. So what they did, and I would say what they did, believe it or not, but again, if you go to the Virus Mania book, you will see the entire documentation of this, is they took children who were paralyzed and some who had died, and they extracted some of their spinal cord that was diseased or their brain tissue after they died. They basically chopped it up like in a blender. They didn't purify it. They didn't see a virus. They didn't have electron microscopes then, so they couldn't see a virus. They didn't see a bacteria. They didn't even filter it. They just took this chopped up, essentially spinal cord tissue and gave it to monkeys to drink. But interestingly, nothing happened. And that was one of the big conundrums of this polio virus situation, is they couldn't find an animal that they could make sick. So then they injected it subcutaneously, like we could give a vaccine. And they injected it subcutaneously into the arms of monkeys, and none of them got sick. So then they decided, we have to prove that this is an infectious disease. So they took a child who was paralyzed. They took some of the diseased anterior horn cells from the nervous system. They chopped it up, took 2 monkeys, drilled holes in their skulls, and injected about 1/4 cup of unpurified spinal fluid goop into their brains, one of the monkeys died, the other one became paralyzed. You can see a picture of the researcher who was crowned as one of the shining lights of infectious disease, holding up the monkey, saying, "This paralyzed monkey proves that it's an infectious disease." Now, I would say, if you ask me what to make of that study, I would say that if I was a monkey and somebody came at me with a bunch of goop from somebody who just died or had a disease in their spinal cord and said, "I want to drill a hole in your brain and inject it in," if I was the monkey, I would run away as fast as I could, because clearly that proves nothing. Now, this same thing was, the same failure of evidence was done with the H1N1 situation. It was done with the H5N1 situation. It was done with SARS. It was done with Hep C. It was done with Ebola virus. It was done with Zika virus. This is not the first rodeo for the failure of the infectious disease community to follow the actual laws and rules that they set up to prove infectious etiology.